Aesan abandoned his elderly mother in the forest and yelled, "I won't take care of you anymore. Stay here to die." Days later, he bitterly regretted discovering what happened to his mother. Edmund, only 8 years old, shrank under the living room table, clutching a worn teddy bear that seemed the only remnant of better times. The silence of the house was only broken by the sound of heavy rain against the roof, and he listened, with a knot in his stomach, to the unmistakable sound of his mother's footsteps. Cassian, 34 years old, arrived home from work with a bitter smell of alcohol. Her eyes were half closed and her face tense, marked by the wrinkles of someone who seemed to carry the weight of the world. Her unkempt brown hair fell over her shoulders, and her expression was a mixture of contempt and weariness. "Hiding again, is it? Just like your father, a good-for-nothing who only knows how to run away." Cassian's voice was cutting, echoing through the room as she looked around as if she saw the boy in every corner of the house. Edmund shrank even more, pressing the teddy bear against his chest, but there was no hiding place enough to ward off those words that hurt him, as if they were blades. Cassian stumbled through the room, kicking chairs and bumping into furniture, as if they were to blame for all the misfortune that had befallen her. The shards of broken bottles on the floor and the accumulated dirt in the corners of the room were the silent testimony of nights of uncontrol and anger. "Come out of there, you coward. You think you can hide from me?" She advanced to the table, leaning over, and her reddened eyes met Edmund's, who now trembled visibly. "I'm not a coward. I just wanted," he mumbled, his voice almost inaudible. Cassian pulled him out from under the table with a brutality that made him let out a small scream, the teddy bear slipping from his hands and falling to the floor. She held him by the arm, shaking him hard, and he tried in vain to break free, but Cassian gripped him more tightly. "Wanted what, huh? For me to treat you like a prince? For me to be the perfect mother to a useless like you?" She suddenly let go of him, almost throwing him to the ground. "Do you think this life is easy? Do you think I have time or patience to be coddling a whiny child?" she asked, making Edmund feel the impact of the words as much as the fall, and he held back tears, aware that any tears would only make her even angrier. He felt so small, so incapable of retaliating, and the only thing he wanted was to disappear. He wanted to go back to his hideout under the table, where he could delude himself that the world was less cruel. I'm not useless. Mommy," he stammered, but Cassian interrupted with a bitter laugh. "Not useless? Look at you. Always hiding, always whining, just like your father. You don't have the courage for anything, to face anything. I should have left you with him and disappeared from this filthy place." Her words were a punch with every syllable, and he felt the impact even without fully understanding everything she said. He only knew that his mother saw him as a burden, something she never wanted to carry. Cassian stumbled to a shelf and with a rough motion knocked over some plates which shattered on the floor, creating a cacophony that made Edmund shudder. "You should be grateful to have a roof. Do you think this is a game? Do you think you can be a kid and dream big?" she yelled, her face contorted, almost unrecognizable. "Look at this house. Look at this life that you've trapped me in. I'll never have peace. I'll never have a rest with you around." Edmund lowered his head, trying in vain to protect himself from the words that hurt more than any physical blow. Each sentence from his mother seemed to squeeze his heart, fear and sadness mingling in a suffocating feeling. He wanted to scream, wanted to say it wasn't his fault, that he never asked to be born, but the lump in his throat prevented him from speaking. Maybe one day you'll understand what it's like to have a mother who has to fight alone," she said, her gaze fixed on him, her eyes red with anger and fatigue. Edmund slowly raised his gaze, hoping to find some trace of compassion on that face, but all he saw was the face of a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. Cassian was not the loving mother he dreamed of. She was a woman full of bitterness and resentment, someone who saw him as the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. I just wanted you to really see me, Mommy," he thought, holding the teddy bear in his lap as if it were the only thing that still gave him any solace. Cassian, however, did not seem willing to stop. She approached him again, her eyes half closed, and pointed a finger at him, her voice low and bitter. "You're going to grow up to be nobody, Edmund, just like your father. A failure. It's no use dreaming. It's no use wanting anything. That's the destiny you've chosen." She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "I should just leave you on the street. You'd fend for yourself better than here, living off me." Her final words cut deep, and Edmund felt like even the air was failing him. He wanted to protest, wanted to beg her to stop, but knew that nothing he said would change what Cassian thought of him. He knew she only saw him as a burden, an obstacle to any hope she might have had one day. He looked at her silently, trying to understand how someone could be so cruel to their own child, but the answers did not come. Who knows, maybe one day all this will end, he muttered softly, but Cassian was no longer listening. At the small neighborhood school, Edmund anxiously awaited the moment of the awards ceremony. It was the most important day for him. His performance in mathematics would finally be recognized, and he hoped his mother would be there to watch. The teachers and other students were gathered in the auditorium, and he looked at the door every minute, believing that Cassian would arrive, even if late. The expectation on Edmund's face was almost palpable, a mixture of nervousness and hope. It was as if that certificate were proof that he was not a burden, but someone of value. However, the chair next to him remained empty. She will come. She promised she would come, he thought, trying to convince himself. The ceremony began, and Edmund's name was announced as the best math student of the year. His heart raced and he walked hesitantly to the stage while the teacher handed him the certificate. The auditorium applauded, but when he looked at the door again, he realized the reality. Cassian would not come. A void took hold of his chest, a bitter feeling he knew well. Still, he held the certificate firmly and raised his gaze, determined not to let anyone see his sadness. One day she will be proud of me. I will be someone important, he promised himself, trying to mask his disappointment. When he arrived home, Edmund found Cassian sitting in the living room, her gaze distant and tired. He entered holding the certificate, hoping that, at least at that moment, she could see something good in him, that she could recognize his effort. He took a few shy steps toward her, his heart pounding. He wanted to show her what he had achieved. He wanted to see some pride in her eyes. "Mom, I won. I was the best in math," he said, extending the certificate toward her as if it were a trophy. Cassian looked at the piece of paper in his hand with disdain, with no trace of emotion on her face. She took the certificate with contempt, turning it over as if it were an object of no value. Her gaze narrowed and her face assumed the expression of weariness and disinterest that Edmund already knew. "And what does that mean, Edmund? Is that paper going to put food on the table? Will it pay the bills?" she said, her voice cold and cutting, returning the certificate to him without even looking him in the eye. He lowered his gaze, feeling a twinge of shame. He knew that award would not change the reality of the house, but it was his achievement, something he had done alone. Still, he tried to insist, holding the certificate with both hands, as if it were the only proof that he had any value. "But Mom, I tried so hard. They said I'm the best in math, and isn't that important?" Cassian snorted, rising from the couch with an irritated expression. She snatched the certificate from his hands with a sudden motion and walked toward the kitchen, where she sharply opened the drawer and grabbed a box of matches. Edmund followed her, confused and with a heavy heart, seeing his dream of recognition crumble before his eyes. Important? Do you really think those things make a difference in real life, Edmund? She lit a match and watched the flame for a moment, before bringing it closer to the certificate. "Paper is worthless. I need money, food, someone who is useful. That's just a silly illusion." The fire began to burn the corner of the paper, and Edmund, horrified, took a step forward, reaching out to try to stop it, but hesitated. He felt helplessness invade his body, as if he were being consumed along with the certificate. The flames spread rapidly, and he saw the achievement turn to ashes piece by piece. "Please, Mum, don't do that. This award is all I have." "It's my only achievement," he pleaded, but Cassian completely ignored him. She just dropped the piece of paper into a trash can and watched as it was consumed by fire. Her gaze was cold and impassive, as if it meant nothing. Edmund looked at the ashes that remained and felt a silent rage grow inside him, an anger he had never experienced before. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her how much it hurt, but he knew nothing would change. "Why do you do this, Mum? Why won't you let me be happy just once?" he finally mumbled, his voice choked. Cassian just shrugged, ignoring the suffering he expressed. To her, that achievement was insignificant, and the sight of Edmund with tears in his eyes had no impact whatsoever. She walked to the sink, grabbed a glass of water and drank without even looking at her son, who remained there, immersed in the pain of having lost the only thing he considered important. Life is not about happiness, Edmund. It's about survival. And you're not helping me at all with these silly things. She placed the glass in the sink, looking at him with disdain. If you want to do something for me, find a way to be useful. This is just a waste of time. Edmund felt a lump in his throat. He had never felt so humiliated, so small. That award, which he believed to be the beginning of something great, was now nothing but ashes at the bottom of a trash can. He held back his tears, but something inside him slowly changed. A determination was forming. A promise he made to himself. One day you'll see, Mama. I'll be important. And you'll regret all of this, he thought, his eyes still fixed on the ashes. Cassian didn't seem to care about anything he said. She looked at him as if he were just a burden, a nuisance she didn't know how to resolve. Edmund then withdrew from the kitchen, but each step he took echoed with silent rage. He knew at that moment that the desire to prove his worth would never leave him. Edmund was sitting in the small kitchen of Mr. Albert's house, an elderly and kind-hearted neighbor who for a long time had perceived the boy's suffering. Albert, with grey hair and a kind face marked by age wrinkles, observed him in silence while offering him a glass of water. He was well aware of the difficult situation Edmund faced with Cassian, the absent and severe mother, and always tried to offer some comfort when the boy showed up at his door. For Edmund, that temporary refuge meant the relief that his own home never provided. "Don't worry, Edmund. Here you can rest without fear. Stay as long as you need," said Mr. Albert, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. Edmund nodded silently, holding the glass of water with trembling hands. It was hard for him to feel safe even in the house of someone as kind as Mr. Albert. The words of affection calmed him momentarily, but he knew that at any moment, Cassian could appear and drag him back to the harsh reality that awaited him. He tried to convince himself that he deserved that break, that small drop of comfort, but guilt and fear would not leave him in peace. Will I ever be able to feel at peace like this, without having to hide, he thought, gripping the glass tightly. But the moment of peace was quickly interrupted by the sound of a loud knock on the door. Edmund's gaze became immediately frightened, and Mr. Albert stood up, casting a cautious look at the boy, as if he knew what was about to happen. Upon opening the door, there was Cassian, her face contorted with fury, and her eyes full of an almost uncontrollable rage. She looked at Mr. Albert with disdain, as if he had committed a great betrayal. "I knew he would be here." "What do you think you're doing, Albert? This boy is my son, my rules," said Cassian, pushing past the neighbor and pulling Edmund by the arm with brutality. Albert tried to intervene, gently but firmly holding Cassian by the arm, trying to make her realize the gravity of the situation. He knew that this mother was going too far, and his heart tightened to see Edmund being treated that way. For Albert, the boy deserved more than the harsh words and violence with which he was treated. Cassian, however, turned and looked at him with a venomous gaze, challenging him to say anything that could stop her anger. "Cassian, you can't treat your son like this. He's just a child. He needs affection, not cruel punishment," Albert said, trying to remain calm, but his voice failing upon seeing Edmund so cowed. But Cassian only laughed with a bitter tone that made Albert recoil. She pulled Edmund harder, ignoring the neighbor's looks of protest. For Cassian, what Mr. Albert thought didn't matter. For her, this was her son, and no one had the right to tell her how to raise him. She dragged him out of the neighbor's house, the boy trying to keep up with her rapid pace, but being pulled mercilessly. "I've already told you, my son, my rules. And you'll learn to obey me, Edmund, even if it's by force," she hissed through clenched teeth, ignoring the silent protest in her son's eyes. As they walked back home, Edmund tried to hold back his tears. Fear and revolt invaded him, mixed in a whirlwind of emotions that he could barely handle. He wished he had the courage to face Cassian, but every time he tried to speak, the words died in his throat. He knew that anything he said could make the situation worse, so he kept silent, keeping everything to himself as he always did. "One day, I swear I won't have to endure this anymore. One day everything will be different," he thought, with a new determination forming in his chest. When they arrived home, Cassian pushed him inside, slamming the door behind her. She was consumed by rage, as if his presence in the neighbor's house was a personal insult. Without saying anything else, she pulled him towards the dark room. a small windowless room where she left him when she wanted to punish him. Edmund knew this place well and what it meant to spend hours there, alone without light, and with fear growing with every minute, his heart pounding as he tried to control his accelerated breathing. Maybe this will teach you not to meddle where you shouldn't. You want to run to other people's houses? Well, now you'll learn to respect the rules here, she said, pushing him into the room. Edmund fell to the floor as he was pushed, but he didn't cry. He felt the tears, yes, but he also felt something deeper and darker within him, a promise that he would never, ever forgive Cassian for what she did to him. He knew he was just a child, but that feeling of hatred grew stronger every day. As he heard the sound of the key turning in the door, he hugged himself, trying to control his breathing. "I swear I'll never forget this, Mum. One day you'll pay me for all of this," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the darkness. With every minute in that dark room, Edmund felt fear giving way to anger, and anger growing into a promise of silent revenge. He remembered Albert's words, the neighbors' attempts to protect him, and realized that perhaps there was someone willing to take care of him, someone who saw him beyond the burden that Cassian insisted on imposing on him. The darkness enveloped him, but he imagined a future where he would no longer feel a prisoner of her control. "If not even Albert can protect me, then I'll learn to protect myself," he told himself, his heart hardening a little more. Days later, Edmund's room seemed even smaller and more stuffy than usual at night. He was sitting on the bed looking out the window at the starry sky. It was his birthday, and he was turning 9. The silence of the house was almost deafening, broken only by some distant noises. Outside, the stars shone, dotting the darkness, and he watched them with a timid hope, as if there he could find something to take him out of that life of fear and loneliness. He knew asking to be happy was something distant, so he sought something simpler. "Please, Star, I want to be strong when I grow up. Stronger than my mum," he whispered, his voice choked. Cassian's voice echoed through the house, breaking the silence and the slight moment of peace that Edmund tried to create. She was in the kitchen. The sound of pots and objects being thrown from side to side echoed through the house. He knew she was preparing something for his birthday, but he couldn't feel joy or anticipation. Cassian never did anything without a purpose behind it, and more than anyone, he knew that his mother didn't let any opportunity pass to remind him of her disdain. "I just hope that at least today you don't humiliate me, Mum," he thought, sighing. The minutes passed, and Edmund heard the sound of the kitchen door opening. Cassian appeared in the hallway, holding a small tray where the cake should be. The smell of burning filled the air, and he immediately realized that something was wrong. The cake he had so longed for as a kind of consolation was just a burnt and misshapen mass. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of frustration and sadness that seemed to want to suffocate him. "Look, your special cake," Cassian said with a bitter smile, approaching him. "I hope you're not expecting anything prettier than that." Edmund looked at the cake, trying to hide his disappointment. It wasn't just the appearance of the cake that hurt him, it was the fact that Cassian had done it on purpose. He would be happy if his mother gave him any old cake, even a burnt one, as long as he knew she had made it from the heart. But Edmund could see in her eyes that there was a sadistic pleasure in watching his sadness. He lowered his head, feeling his face hot, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to roll down. "It's okay, Mom. I know you can't have everything you want. I'm happy that this year you remembered it's my birthday. I don't care about the appearance of the cake," he mumbled in an almost inaudible voice, trying not to show how much it affected him, but Cassian didn't miss the opportunity to mock him. She laughed loudly, with a sharp laugh that echoed through the room, making Edmund feel even smaller. For her, his sadness was something funny, something that strengthened her in some way. She put the cake on the little table next to the bed and crossed her arms, looking at him with an air of superiority. "Look at that, so ungrateful. Can't even appreciate what I do. Do you think it's easy to do anything in this house?" "You should be grateful," she said, her voice loaded with irony. Edmund felt humiliation grow inside him like a flame, but remained silent. He knew responding would only make things worse. He looked at the burnt cake, trying to disguise the revolt that bubbled inside him. Cassian continued to stare at him, waiting for some reaction, something that would confirm the power she had over him. "One day I'll be strong enough that none of this will hurt me," he thought with a silent determination that grew in his chest. She leaned over, taking a piece of the cake with her fingers, and throwing it onto his plate with contempt. The dough crumbled, showing how poorly made it was. Cassian smiled as if that were the final victory, and took a step back, watching him with the expectation of seeing his sadness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his anger. "Come on, Edmund, eat. I want to see you enjoy the cake I made especially for you," she provoked, her voice loaded with sarcasm. He took a small piece, feeling the bitter taste that reinforced Cassian's disdain. Every bite was a reminder of the reality he lived in, a confirmation that his mother would never change. But at the same time, every swallowed piece was a silent promise that he would become someone she could not humiliate again. "Thank you, Mum. It's good," he said with difficulty, though he knew it was an obvious lie. Cassian watched his attempt to disguise his sadness, but realized she hadn't quite gotten what she wanted. The boy didn't cry, didn't react as she expected, and that made her even more nervous. She approached, taking the cake and crushing it with force, as if she wanted to destroy even the attempt for him to find any satisfaction there. "Good? This is what you deserve, Edmund." "Nothing more than a piece of trash," she said, her voice cold. He looked away, but her words pierced like knives. Edmund looked at the stars through the window, longing for a future where he could free himself from that cycle of suffering and humiliation. He knew asking for love from Cassian was in vain, so he promised himself that one day he would leave all that behind. "One day I won't need any of this. One day you won't have power over me anymore," he whispered to himself, his gaze fixed on the stars. His mother took a step back, laughing softly as she watched him. For her, each of his birthdays was a reminder of her own failure. The date she had been waiting for was coming. She needed to do what was necessary, before it was too late. And at that moment, Edmund realized that if he wanted to survive this, he would have to be stronger than he ever imagined. 29 years later, Edmund, now a more mature man, was sitting in his spacious and luxurious study, surrounded by glass panels and modern furniture that reflected the success he had built. At 38 years old, he was the director of one of the country's largest companies, respected and feared in equal measure. The impeccable appearance and calculated gaze were part of his trademark. He exuded confidence and authority, characteristics he used to keep everyone around him at a safe emotional and professional distance. However, the touch of the telephone interrupted his meticulously controlled routine. "Sir, there's a woman. She says she's your mother." "Cassian, she said her name is Cassian." "Well, she's at the reception and wishes to speak with you," the receptionist informed him, her voice hesitant. Edmund remained silent for a moment, his face hardening at hearing that name. It had been years since the last time he had seen her or even heard about her, as he had decided to leave home as soon as he came of age and never looked back. The news was unexpected and provoked a mixture of feelings that he thought he had buried. He looked at his watch, assessing the time he could make her wait. The anger and contempt he harbored for Cassian were still fresh in his memory, like scars impossible to erase. "Tell her to wait. I'm busy, something she never was for me," he said coldly, hanging up the phone before the receptionist could respond. Hours passed, and Edmund kept himself occupied with meetings and reports, deliberately ignoring Cassian's presence at the reception. The image of his mother from years ago still haunted him, every memory of abuse and contempt fueling the wall of resentment he had built. It was a bitter irony to think that now, after everything, she was there, needing him. The feeling of control over the situation brought him a sadistic pleasure, leaving her waiting. "As I waited for years for a gesture of love that never came," he murmured, satisfied with the power he had over her. Finally, he decided to receive her. He stood up and walked to the waiting room, his steps firm and controlled. As he entered, his eyes fell upon Cassian's aged and frail figure sitting with her head bowed. Her face showed the marks of time and regret, and her eyes, once hardened, now reflected a vulnerability he had never imagined seeing. She raised her gaze to him, and Edmund saw what seemed to be tenderness and guilt on her face. "Edmund, I'm sorry for showing up like this. I didn't want to bother you. I know you don't want to be around me, but I need you," Cassian said, her voice low and laden with humility. He crossed his arms, his face impassive. Her words did not move him. Years of contempt and resentment had made his heart impenetrable to any feeling of compassion she might now try to awaken. After his 10th birthday, he underwent a complicated surgery, and it was from that day on that his mother began to change. But for him, no excuse was enough. Her plea was an insult, a reminder of everything he had to endure alone. "Are you busy now, Cassian? Busy like you always were, drunk when I was a child? Or will you keep pretending that you love me and are sorry?" he asked, his tone laden with irony and bitterness. She lowered her head, seeming to absorb every word as a deserved punishment. In her eyes there was a profound sadness, and her body seemed frail, as if she were about to collapse. Cassian took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice came out choked. "I know I shouldn't have done anything I did to you, but I've changed, Edmund. Please, let me explain," she pleaded, her eyes begging for a chance at redemption. Edmund let out a short, incredulous laugh. For him, nothing Cassian said would change what happened. He was who he was because of the scars she left him, and the success he had achieved was only proof that he didn't need her. The sight of her there, vulnerable and remorseful, was an irony he was willing to savor. "Explain years and years later? There's nothing to explain. Now that you need help, you come to me?" he said, his words sharp and cold. Cassian extended her hand as if she wanted to touch him, but Edmund pulled back, keeping his distance. Her gesture was pathetic in his eyes, as if it were an empty plea. She seemed hesitant, her hand trembling in the air before falling to her side. Edmund watched her with silent contempt, unmoved by her frail appearance. "Edmund, I'm sick. I didn't want it to be like this, but I need to see a doctor. I have no one else. And you're my son," Cassian said, her voice trembling. He stared at her, his eyes hardened with no apparent compassion. He couldn't see in her the image of a mother. He only saw an aged woman who now sought the support she had never offered him. The irony of the situation was a bitter consolation for him, and the idea of helping her was almost unbearable. But he knew that if he didn't help her, she would remain there, a weight he didn't want to carry. "You mean you're sick? Is that my fault too? I can't do anything for you, Cassian. If you needed a son, you should have thought about that before putting me through everything I went through," he said, his words laden with resentment. Cassian held his chest, the expression of pain clear on his face. He realized she was really unwell, but still he couldn't feel pity. For him, her pain was just a late consequence of all the choices she had made in the past. She raised her eyes with difficulty, still trying to reach some remnant of humanity in him. "I love you, Edmund. I know it's hard to believe, but I love you. I've always loved you. If you let me explain. If you listen to me, I can leave in peace knowing that. You know how much I love you," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. Edmund averted his gaze, unable to bear the hypocrisy of those words. For him, that love was nothing more than a belated attempt to redeem herself, an empty effort that did not reach him. He took a deep breath, trying to control the revolt he felt at seeing her there so weak and needy, something he never thought he would witness. Love is something you never knew what it was. And now do you think I'm going to believe you?" he replied with a tone of disdain. Cassian closed her eyes for a moment, tears silently streaming down her face. Edmund remained motionless, impassive, offering no solace. He knew that suffering was a reflection of the past, a kind of belated justice that brought him a strange sense of satisfaction. But at the same time, he felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. "Please, Edmund, just go to the doctor with me. Let's take this time to talk." "I just need to go to the doctor," Cassian pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. He sighed, irritated by her persistence, but realized she wouldn't leave alone. In silence, he picked up the phone and told the receptionist that he would bring a companion without mentioning it was his mother. Cassian looked at him with a mix of hope and gratitude, but Edmund didn't look back at her. "Let's go. It seems you won't leave here until we go, so the sooner this is over, the better," he said coldly. She followed him in silence, and their footsteps echoed down the hallway like a weight they both carried in opposite directions. Edmund entered the public hospital with quick, decisive steps, as if the situation were a minor inconvenience he wanted to resolve as quickly as possible. By his side, Cassian walked slowly, her face tired and her shoulders drooping, reflecting the frailty that age and years of regret had brought her. Her eyes sought the slightest connection with her son, but he kept his gaze firmly ahead, not giving her a chance to get close. Upon reaching the reception, Edmund spoke impatiently, without addressing Cassian directly. "How long will this take?" "I have more important commitments," he muttered to himself, ignoring his mother's dejected look. Cassian lowered her head, feeling the weight of each of her son's words like a new stab wound. She knew his resentment ran deep, but every cold gesture still hurt her. As they waited, she tried to break the silence, straining to create some bond. But Edmund remained impassive, his gaze fixed on some random point, as if she weren't even there. "Edmund, I know all this hurts you, but—" she tried to say, but he cut her off with a cutting look. "Don't start with that now, Cassian. We're here for an appointment, nothing more. Stay quiet," he said, his voice cold and distant. Finally, they were called by the doctor, a middle-aged man with worried eyes who guided them to a small examination room. He examined Cassian's records, casting a concerned look at Edmund before turning to the patient. Cassian smiled slightly at the doctor, trying to appear serene, but the tension on her face was evident. The doctor turned to Edmund, assuming a serious tone. "Mr. Edmund, your mother needs regular care. Her health is deteriorating, and it's essential that someone accompanies her," the doctor said, trying to gauge the son's reaction. Edmund just laughed, a dry sound devoid of humor, as if the doctor's concern was a tasteless joke. He looked at Cassian with contempt, and his expression made it clear how much he saw the situation as a bitter irony. The idea of caring for her was almost comical to him, considering the past neglect she had given him. "She never took care of me, Doctor. Why should I do anything for her now?" Edmund retorted, his words laden with resentment. The doctor gave him a disapproving look, but upon hearing that, Cassian lowered her head, feeling each word as an even heavier burden. She clenched her hands, as if trying to contain the pain growing in her chest. Edmund watched her with a contempt he made no effort to hide. For him, her weakness did not arouse pity. It was just a natural consequence of everything she had done. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Edmund, but—" she began in a trembling voice before being cut off again. "Forgive? You want me to forgive years of abuse? Do you think some words of apology will erase everything?" Edmund responded, his voice cutting. The doctor cleared his throat, trying to interrupt the growing tension. It was clear he was uncomfortable with the hostility between mother and son, but his duty was to warn about the gravity of Cassian's situation. He paused, trying to assess how to proceed without aggravating the already tense atmosphere. "Edmund, I understand that your relationship may have been complicated, but your mother is in a delicate situation. She needs constant attention, especially with the treatments she will have to follow," the doctor explained, carefully choosing his words. Edmund rolled his eyes, exhaling impatience. For him, those recommendations were almost an insult. Taking care of someone who had never cared for him, who had never shown affection or consideration, seemed an absurd idea. He looked at the doctor, trying to gauge how much longer he would have to endure that conversation, which, for him, made no sense. "She had a whole lifetime to take care of me, Doctor. Now excuse me if I'm not the person she expects me to be," he said, his voice laced with bitter irony. Cassian sighed, feeling the humiliation Edmund inflicted on her mercilessly. Her expression showed deep remorse, but she knew that nothing she said would change the past. Her tearful eyes sought her son's understanding, but he averted his gaze every time she tried to approach him, as if she were an unwanted presence. "Please, Edmund, I'm not asking for anything more than a little compassion," she murmured, her voice broken. Edmund looked at her with disdain, almost amused by the irony of the whole situation. The woman who had never cared for him now begged for attention and care. He couldn't contain the contempt he felt, and the words spilled out of his mouth before he could stop himself. "Compassion? The same compassion you showed me, locked in the dark room night after night," he retorted, his voice low and cold. The doctor looked at them, visibly uncomfortable with the tension that emanated from the mother-son relationship. He took a deep breath, trying to intercede once again to calm Edmund and at the same time warn him of the gravity of the situation. "Edmund, your mother is in a fragile state of health. If she doesn't receive care, the consequences could be irreversible," the doctor insisted, trying to appeal to the son's sense of responsibility. But Edmund merely smiled, an empty smile, as if his mother's life meant absolutely nothing to him. He looked at Cassian, whose face was pale and weary, her pleading eyes trying to find some answer. But Edmund's heart was closed, colder than ever before. Irreversible. Perhaps it's just fate claiming its due, Doctor. We all pay for our choices, he said, not taking his eyes off Cassian. Cassian shrank at those words, feeling the weight of her son's contempt like a final sentence. The pain in her chest was immense, but she knew it was a reflection of all she had caused. The doctor looked at her, a trace of compassion on his face as he tried to deal with Edmund's indifference. I just want to do what I can to improve and not be a burden to you in the future. But I understand that maybe that's too much to ask, she said, almost in a whisper. Edmund stood up abruptly, signaling the end of the consultation. For him, the time he had wasted there was enough, and any appeal from Cassian was in vain. He looked at the doctor with impatience, implying that the conversation had already ended. Hours later, in Edmund's luxurious and immaculate mansion, he walked through the spacious corridors surrounded by elegant furniture and works of art. The success and power he had built over the years were now materialized in that grandiose environment. For him, every detail of that house was a victory over the past, proof that he had overcome the emotional misery in which Cassian had raised him. Agatha, his wife, was in the living room, observing him with an affectionate and worried look, perceiving the weariness and tension he carried after the visit to the hospital. Edmund, are you okay? You took a long time. I called your workplace to look for you. The receptionist said you had to accompany your mother to the doctor. I thought this consultation with your mother could bring back painful memories, said Agatha, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. Edmund smiled sideways, but the gleam in his eyes was not one of affection. It was a cold, calculated look, the same one he always had when speaking of Cassian. His mind was filled with anger, but also with an idea that was taking shape. Something he knew could turn that forced reunion into an opportunity to settle scores. Agatha, my mother needs care, but she will get what she deserves. Don't worry about me, he said, his tone laden with sinister calm. Agatha observed Edmund's face, trying to decipher the conflicting emotions that seemed to linger on it. She knew about the pains of Edmund's past, how difficult his childhood had been, but she believed that the strong and determined man by her side was capable of forgiveness. It was then that an idea arose in her mind, something she thought was the path to redemption that Edmund so deserved. Why don't you bring her to live here, Edmund? That way she could receive all the care and attention she needs. And maybe that will help you overcome the past, Agatha suggested, her tone gentle and laden with good intentions. Edmund looked at her, surprised by the suggestion, but at the same instant, a somber gleam appeared in his gaze. The idea of having Cassian under his roof, of placing her before all the luxury and comfort he had achieved without her, awakened a perverse satisfaction within him. It was the perfect opportunity to show her everything she had lost, and he could use her as he wanted, under the guise of care and compassion. Bring my mother to live with us, Agatha. Interesting. I could offer her all the comfort she never gave me, he said with a slight smile that Agatha interpreted as a glimmer of tenderness, but which hid a sinister plan. Agatha, oblivious to the glint of revenge in her husband's eyes, felt satisfied with his decision. She believed that the act of caring for his mother would be an important step for Edmund to leave behind the resentment that was corroding him from within. She placed her hands in his, as if she wanted to give him strength to face the past with generosity and forgiveness. Edmund, I'm sure this will be good for both of you. She will be able to feel the affection and care that perhaps she has never received. And you, maybe you'll find a new beginning, she said, her voice soft and hopeful. Edmund held her hands and nodded, but his thoughts were far from redemption or forgiveness. For him, this would be the perfect opportunity to rewrite the past in the way he deemed fair. Cassian would live under his roof, yes, but he would make sure that each day was a bitter reminder of what she had put him through. With a smile that hid his true feelings, he responded to Agatha. You're right, Agatha. She needs that care, and I'm the only one capable of offering it. I will treat her as she deserves, he said, his words laden with a sarcasm that Agatha did not perceive. Agatha smiled, touched by her husband's decision, believing that he was taking an important step towards forgiveness and emotional healing. Unaware of Edmund's sinister intentions, she devoted herself to making preparations for Cassian's arrival. With genuine enthusiasm, Edmund watched her in silence, satisfied with her naivety, which facilitated his plan. Agatha is convinced that this is for the good of everyone. Little does she know how much my mother needs to pay for what she did, thought Edmund, containing the somber pleasure that filled him. The next day, Cassian arrived at the mansion, greeted by Agatha, who treated her with utmost kindness. Edmund observed from afar, his expression impassive as he watched his mother being led to the guest room, which Agatha had prepared with all her care. Cassian was visibly moved by the care and attention she received, but Edmund looked at her with coldness, unable to feel any compassion for her state. "Welcome to your new home, Cassian. I hope you enjoy every detail, since you now have someone to take care of you," he said, his voice low and full of irony. Cassian raised her gaze to him, surprised and grateful. The gleam in her eyes showed the hope of a new beginning, of finally rebuilding her relationship with her son. She stretched out her hand, trying to touch his face in a gesture of affection, but Edmund subtly pulled back, keeping his distance and making it clear that his interest there was not love. "Thank you, Edmund. I didn't expect this from you. It's more than I deserve," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He observed her for a moment, trying to gauge how much guilt she really felt for the past, but his feelings were blocked by layers of resentment. Cassian, even with the weight of age and failing health, still represented for him all those years of pain and humiliation. Edmund saw no fresh start. He saw an opportunity to remind her day after day of what she had made him suffer. "I'm just returning what I received, only with a more refined touch," he thought, watching Cassian settle into the room. Agatha watched her husband with admiration, proud of what she believed was an act of generosity. She didn't know that. For Edmund, every gesture of care was an irony, a way to make clear to Cassian that she was everything he had never given her. She approached him, holding his hand and giving him an encouraging look. "Edmund, I'm sure this will bring you peace. It's not easy, but you're doing the right thing," she said with a soft smile when her husband's mother couldn't hear her. Edmund returned the smile, but inwardly he savored the contrast between the facade of benevolence and the true purpose that guided him. He knew that as long as Cassian lived under his roof, every gesture of his would be a reminder of what she had destroyed in the past, and he would make sure she felt it. "Yes, Agatha, I'm doing what's right, and every day will show her what it means to have no true home," he whispered, with calculated calm. As Cassian settled into the room, Edmund felt a bitter satisfaction, certain that his mother was finally under his control. The next day, in the small meeting room of the support group, Cassian held her 15-year sobriety medal in her hands, the metal gleaming under the artificial light. She felt the weight of the past, but also the lightness of an achievement that seemed unattainable years ago. Life had taught her harsh lessons, and each of those 15 years without drinking had been a battle fought against her own demons. With the medal in her hand, she smiled, though with a certain sadness, wishing things had been different, that the choices she had made in the past had not caused so much suffering. "I did this for you, Edmund, but I know you may never understand," she thought, feeling a tear escape. The simple ceremony ended, and Cassian thanked her support friends, who congratulated her with words of encouragement and sincere hugs. Even after years of sobriety, the memory of mistakes and abuses still haunted her, but the weight was a little lighter when shared with people who understood her. She carefully put away the medal, like a treasure that symbolized not only the time without alcohol, but also the determination to try to redeem herself. "It's a small symbol, but it's proof that I tried to change even if too late," she murmured to herself, putting the medal in her pocket. As she left the building, a familiar figure was waiting outside. Edmund, with a cold look, remained standing, arms crossed and expression impassive. Cassian stopped when she saw him, surprised and slightly intimidated. She hadn't expected him to be there to take her home, let alone at such an intimate moment. "My son, I earned a medal for 15 years of sobriety. I did this for you," she said, trying to demonstrate her change. But his eyes rested on the medal she raised to show him, and a spark of irony shone on his face, something between contempt and a somber satisfaction. "So you finally got your medal," he said, his voice low and cutting. "What a pity it's too late, isn't it?" Cassian felt her face flush with shame. Edmund's cold tone, laden with sarcasm, struck her like a knife. She had dreamed so many times of the moment when she could show him that she was a different person, that she had changed. but the coldness and contempt on her son's face showed her that he was not there to get emotional or to offer support. I know I made mistakes, Edmund, but I've changed and I had reasons. I wanted you to be able to hear me, she said, her voice trembling and laden with guilt. Edmund let out a dry laugh, as if those words were a tasteless joke. He approached, his eyes fixed on the medal Cassian held so carefully. To him, that symbol of victory was just a sham, a pathetic attempt to wipe away the stains of the past. Contempt was visible on his face, and every gesture made it clear that he was not there to support her. Changed? I think 15 years of sobriety won't erase the years you left me alone, locked in the dark, he said, the words like blades. Cassian recoiled, feeling the weight of those words like a sentence. Shame and regret made it difficult to even hold his gaze. She knew she could never make up for the years of neglect, but she hadn't expected his contempt to be so deep and relentless. She swallowed hard, trying to find the strength to respond, but her voice failed before she could say anything. I know I can't change the past, but I wanted you to see that today I'm a better person, she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. Edmund reached out, grabbing her medal with a rough and clumsy motion without asking permission. Cassian looked at him, surprised and alarmed, as if she couldn't believe what he was doing. Edmund twirled the medal between his fingers, examining it with a cold and disinterested look, as if it were a trivial object, something worthless. Funny. You're proud of this, as if it were some great achievement, he said with an ironic smile. But what does it mean to me? Absolutely nothing. Cassian tried to take the medal back, but he easily pushed it out of her reach, holding it beyond her grasp. She reached out desperately, but knew that Edmund was determined to humiliate her. He didn't seem willing to show compassion or respect. Every gesture, every word, was a painful reminder for Cassian that the past was a shadow she could never erase. Edmund, please. This medal represents years of struggle. I worked so hard to be able to change, she pleaded, her voice desperate. Edmund watched her, an expression of disdain on his face, as if her pain was something insignificant, something he could disregard without remorse. He spun the medal in his fingers once more, before finally casting a cold glance at Cassian. The contempt in his eyes was clear and unwavering. Our years of struggle. Then it's exactly like my math certificate, isn't it? The one you made sure to burn in front of me, he said, with a grim smile, his eyes shining with bitter satisfaction. Cassian felt her heart tighten at those words. The memory of the certificate, burned in a moment of impulsive cruelty, was a wound that had never fully healed. Seeing Edmund there, holding the medal with the same contempt she had shown years ago, was the worst form of justice she could imagine. Before she could say anything, he lit the lighter, holding the medal over the flame, with the same cold smile. No, Edmund, please don't do this. This medal means everything to me, she begged, reaching out her hands, her voice laden with despair. He remained impassive, watching the flames begin to lick at the medal's edge. For him, this was the moment of revenge he had waited so many years for. Cassian's tears, the pleading in her voice, were a bitter consolation, a kind of victory over the years of pain and disdain she had inflicted on him. Now you understand how I felt, Cassian, when you destroyed the only thing that mattered to me, he said, as the medal became just a smudge of soot in his hands. Cassian watched, unable to hold back tears, as the medal that represented her redemption came undone before her eyes. It shrank, helpless, as she let the ashes fall to the floor as if they were nothing more than trash. Edmund looked at her with the same coldness he had looked at her all those years ago, and turned his back, leaving her there with what was left of the medal. It's too late, Cassian. Too late for any redemption, he whispered. Cassian stood still, tears streaming down her face as she held what remained of the medal, now reduced to ashes and twisted metal. When they got home, the atmosphere seemed charged with silent tension. Edmund went straight to the office, carrying a hard, cold expression. Cassian, on the other hand, seemed to have shrunk even more, as if every inch of her presence was imbued with regret and weariness. Agatha, who had observed Edmund's behavior, approached Cassian, gently leading her to the living room, and the two sat down. Agatha could see the suffering in her mother-in-law's eyes, the pain mixed with an anguish that seemed to come from years of repressed secrets. Cassian, are you okay? What happened at the meeting? You seemed so excited when you left here. Why did you come home like this? Agatha asked softly, placing a comforting hand on Cassian's shoulder. Cassian sighed, holding Agatha's hand tightly, as if that gesture of support was the anchor preventing her from completely falling apart. She looked around as if making sure Edmund wasn't around, but he was. Hidden in the hallway entrance, he silently observed, with an inscrutable expression, curious about what Cassian had to tell. He had never heard her share anything but empty excuses and words that meant nothing to him. "Agatha, I don't even know where to begin. I've spent so many years trying to redeem myself, but maybe there is no forgiveness for what I did. I tried to be a good mother, I tried to correct my mistakes even during Edmund's childhood, but it was too late." "He won't let me explain," Cassian began. Her voice choked. Agatha looked at her with empathy, and Edmund, hidden, listened intently to every word, intrigued by his mother's serious and profound tone. There was something there he didn't understand, something that bothered him in an almost imperceptible way. To him, every gesture of Cassian's was a sham, but what she was beginning to say seemed different. "I know he will never forgive. And maybe he shouldn't, Agatha. I failed Edmund in every possible way. And worst of all, it was a choice. A choice I made knowing how much it would hurt. And that destroyed me at the same time," she said, her voice breaking. Edmund felt a twinge of surprise, a slight disturbance he couldn't explain. This confession didn't seem to be just guilt. There was something more, something dark and deep that he had never imagined hearing from his mother. Agatha, in a comforting gesture, squeezed Cassian's hand and encouraged her to continue, her eyes reflecting compassion. "Cassian, we all make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes seem unforgivable, but the first step is to face what happened," Agatha said in an understanding tone. Cassian took a deep breath, her face contorting in an expression of pain and sadness that went beyond guilt. She looked at Agatha, her eyes shining with an anguish that Edmund, from his hiding place, noticed for the first time. It wasn't just regret. There was something more, something buried in the depths of her soul. She began to speak, as if tearing each word from a dark place. "Agatha, I was so cruel, and the worst part is, I didn't have a choice. I never did. I was a mother. I had a duty to protect him, to love him," Cassian confessed, her voice so low it almost disappeared. Edmund heard that with wide eyes, his heart beating faster. He didn't expect to hear something so raw, so bare. The vision he had of Cassian as an unloving and cruel mother began to be questioned, and the anger that had always accompanied him faltered, even if he didn't want to admit it. So was that it? Anger and contempt. And now she thinks she can fix it with a few words? He thought, trying to resist the idea that Cassian could have any real regret. Agatha, sensing the depth of Cassian's words, pulled her into a comforting embrace. She saw a woman destroyed by her own past, who was trying even belatedly to find some peace. Edmund watched in silence, his heart divided between resentment and a new feeling he couldn't identify. "Cassian, I'm so sorry for all this pain. But it's never too late to change, to try to mend what was broken. Edmund may take time to understand, but the fact that you're here facing all this is already a step," Agatha said gently. Cassian remained silent for a moment, closing her eyes as she felt the tears stream down. There was something in those words that made her wish everything could be different. But she knew the weight of the past was a burden that would never leave her. "I would give anything not to have had to do that. But he's right to hate me. It's the price I pay. I made my choice and now I have to live with it," Cassian whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. Edmund felt a lump in his throat as he heard that. He had never imagined that Cassian could carry such a weight, and the idea that she was truly remorseful unsettled him. He turned away, trying to push away what he had heard, but her words echoed in his mind, challenging every belief he had held his entire life. Was it really that simple? Does she really carry this guilt? He thought, not knowing how to deal with the possibility. Cassian looked at Agatha, wiping away the tears with the back of her hand, and tried to smile, albeit with difficulty. For her, every gesture, every word, was an attempt to rebuild what she had lost. She knew she could never undo the past, but she felt she had to try, no matter how difficult it was. "Thank you, Agatha. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only person who can still see something good in me," she said, her voice soft and sincere. Agatha smiled, holding Cassian's hand, and unknowingly planting doubt in Edmund that he had never thought he would have. Hours later, Agatha was in the mansion's library, organizing some old documents and albums that Edmund rarely looked at. Among contracts and papers, an aged envelope caught her attention. Upon opening it, she found some photographs that seemed to have been forgotten for years. They were images of Edmund, still a child, about 10 years old, in a hospital bed, pale and thin, with tired eyes. In each photo, he looked frail, as if he were facing a silent illness. Agatha frowned, surprised and confused. She had never known of any of Edmund's childhood hospitalizations, nor had he ever mentioned anything like that. Edmund never told me anything about this. Why would he hide something so important? She murmured to herself, feeling a weight of concern. With the photos in her hands, she went to his office where she found him reviewing some documents, concentrated and with the severe expression he always assumed when dealing with work. She hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words, but curiosity and concern prompted her to question him. She entered, carefully but resolutely placing the photos on his desk. "Edmund, what are these photos? Why didn't you ever tell me about these hospitalizations?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with concern. Edmund looked at the photos, his expression confused, as if he were seeing something that didn't make sense. He picked up the images, observing his own childish face, marked by a weariness he didn't remember feeling. Surprise mingled with doubt, and he looked at Agatha with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. I don't remember this, Agatha. I don't recall being hospitalized as a child," he replied, his tone hesitant, still trying to process what he saw. Agatha felt a chill upon hearing that. The idea that Edmund didn't remember something so significant from his childhood left her disconcerted. It was evident that he had gone through a delicate situation, but the fact that he didn't remember anything made her question what else might be hidden in his memories. She looked at him, trying to understand the reason for this block. "Edmund, these photos show you in the hospital clearly debilitated. How is it possible that you don't remember any of this? Something so serious," she said, her voice low but persistent. Edmund averted his gaze, uncomfortable with the images. He tried to dig into the depths of his memory, but all he found was a void. The feeling of not remembering something that seemed so important caused him a strange anguish. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to force out some memory, but there was nothing but darkness. "Agatha, I simply can't remember. It's as if those photos were of someone else," he murmured, frustration evident on his face. Agatha placed a hand on his shoulder, as if she wanted to convey security and support to him. For her, it was clear that something very painful was buried in Edmund's past, something he had blocked from his mind, perhaps as a way of protecting himself. She knew that insisting could be painful for him, but she couldn't ignore the gravity of what she saw in the images. "Edmund, don't you think this deserves to be remembered? Something made you block out these memories, and perhaps facing them is important," she said, trying to encourage him to confront the past. Edmund looked at her, his eyes laden with uncertainty and a remnant of fear. The idea of delving into memories he barely knew existed frightened him more than he would like to admit. Throughout his life, he had built his strength on forgetting, on a buried and unexplored past. Reviving any fragment of those memories seemed a threat to the stability he had achieved. "What if there's a reason I don't remember, Agatha? What if dredging this up only brings more pain?" he responded, in a cold but insecure tone. Agatha squeezed his hand, her eyes fixed on his, determined to help him find answers. She saw in those photos a fragility that contrasted sharply with the strong and impenetrable man he had become. It was as if the boy in the images and the man before her were different people, separated by a wall of silence and oblivion that she wanted to break. "Edmund, sometimes facing the pain is the only way to overcome it. That boy in the photo, he's a part of you, and understanding what happened could be the key to moving forward," she said, her voice full of affection. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear, not knowing what to think. Her words made sense, but he was so accustomed to leaving the past behind that the idea of facing those memories disconcerted him. He wondered if he was truly ready to open that door, to discover what he might have deliberately buried. "What if I don't want to know, Agatha? What if what I find only destroys what I've become?" he murmured, a tone of vulnerability emerging in his voice. Agatha realized the vulnerability in Edmund's gaze, something he rarely showed. She knew him as someone strong and relentless, but in the face of those photos he seemed disarmed, almost lost. She felt this was the moment to insist, to encourage him to take a step towards the past, not to reopen it, but to try to find peace. "You are stronger than you think, Edmund. Don't be afraid of what you'll find. I'm here with you, and together we'll face it, whatever it is," she said firmly, gently touching his face. Edmund held her hand for a moment, his gaze full of gratitude and apprehension. He knew Agatha was right, but the fear of confronting an unknown reality was almost paralyzing. Still, something inside him began to awaken, a troubling curiosity that led him to want to know more, to understand why those memories were locked so deep. "Maybe I need to know, maybe there's no way to escape this forever," he thought, finally accepting the idea. Agatha smiled, seeing in him the determination she had always admired, and embraced him affectionately. Days later, at Edmund's luxurious mansion, everything was ready for the party. The chandeliers gleamed, the crystal glasses were carefully arranged, and high society guests eagerly awaited the drinks and delicacies that were served with impeccable efficiency. The music played at a moderate volume, creating a sophisticated and refined atmosphere. Amidst all the pomp, Cassian stood out, not for status, but for the simple servant's clothing Edmund had forced her to wear. With a tray of drinks in her hands, she walked back and forth offering drinks, trying to remain invisible, while facing the weight of her humiliation. "This is what you deserve, Cassian. A little honest work doesn't hurt anyone, don't you think?" Edmund said in a low and cutting tone as he passed by her, as if his words were a constant reminder of the contempt he felt for her. Cassian held the tray firmly, averting her gaze. She knew that Edmund wanted more than to see her work. He wanted explicit humiliation. He wanted every guest to see her as the fragile woman he had placed there to serve them. The years of sobriety and effort to redeem herself were invisible that night. She took a deep breath, maintaining her composure, refusing to give in to humiliation. Still, Edmund continued to watch her from afar, his gaze cold and calculated, waiting for any sign of weakness. "I can endure this. For him I endure anything," she muttered to herself, as if trying to gain strength. With firm steps she continued among the guests, offering the drinks without hesitation. At no point did she take a drop of alcohol to her lips, remaining faithful to the commitment she had made to herself and the effort that led her to 15 years of sobriety. She knew this was another test, that Edmund was waiting for any slip, any sign that she would return to being the woman he despised. But with each drink served, it was a silent victory, an affirmation that despite everything she was there, sober and determined. "The past will not defeat me. Not now, not while I can still prove that I've changed," thought Cassian, feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. Among the guests, an elderly doctor watched her intently, frowning as he recognized her. He was a man of a tired expression, but his eyes were still perceptive, as if they knew more than they appeared. He approached Cassian cautiously, his demeanor laden with curiosity and surprise. As he stood before her, he studied her for a moment before finally speaking. "Cassian, is that you?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "How long has it been? How is your son? Did he pass away? After all these years?" Cassian stopped, her face pale and her expression completely disoriented. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, leaving her stunned. She opened her mouth to respond, but the shock prevented her from finding the right words. For a second, everything around seemed to stop, as if the world were suspended in that disturbing phrase, the memory of something she had tried to bury deeply. I don't remember you," she lied, still processing the question, her face taken by astonishment. The doctor, without realizing the lie, hesitated, as if something were out of place. He cast a glance toward Edmund, who was now watching the scene with a petrified expression, as if each word from the doctor were an unexpected revelation. Edmund approached, trying to maintain his composure, but a shadow of unease crossed his face. "Doctor, I heard what you said. I don't know where you're going with these questions. It's clear there's been a misunderstanding," Edmund said with a calculated calm, but the tone revealed slight discomfort. The doctor frowned, confused, and looked from Cassian to Edmund, trying to understand what was happening there. It was evident that he knew something Cassian wanted to keep secret, something that, until that moment, seemed buried in the past. Edmund watched Cassian with calculated intensity, as if he were analyzing every movement, every expression. The doctor's mention of a dead son echoed in his mind, and seeing Cassian's reaction, something in him ignited. He realized there was more to the matter than it appeared, something she was reluctant to reveal. Instead of backing down, Edmund decided to pressure her. He knew she was hiding something, and after all they'd been through, he wasn't willing to let her get away. "Cassian, you were startled by what he said," Edmund began, keeping his tone controlled, but his eyes firm on her. "There's no use denying it. I saw it. What do you know about this, about the dead son?" he insisted, not diverting his gaze. Cassian averted her eyes, trying to compose herself, but the discomfort was evident. She held the tray of drinks with trembling hands, and any assurance she had maintained until then seemed to crumble under the weight of the son's question. She tried to force a smile, but there was no conviction on her face. On the contrary, the mask of calm was fragmenting. "Edmund, please. This man must have gotten confused. I don't know what he meant by that," she responded, her voice low, as if hoping he wouldn't insist. Edmund took a step forward, not giving her space to escape. The party, the guests, the surrounding environment, nothing else mattered. He stared at her, as if he were finally discovering a truth that had always been there, waiting to be revealed. Her evasive answer only irritated him further, and his tone became more incisive. "Don't play dumb, Cassian. I know when you're hiding something," he said, his voice harsh and his eyes sharp. "You've always had secrets. But this time I won't let you run away. What do you know about this dead son?" She bit her lips, trying to maintain her composure, but Edmund's relentless gaze was dismantling her. She knew he wouldn't stop until he got an answer, and for the first time she felt the desperation of facing the truth she had kept hidden for so many years. She tried to find the right words, something that could convince him to give up on the idea, but her voice faltered. "Edmund, I don't know anything. It's not what you think." "The doctor was confused, that's all," she lied, hesitant but aware that he wouldn't believe a word. Edmund gave a slight smile, but there was nothing kind or friendly about it. It was a cold smile, full of distrust and disbelief. He already knew that game of Cassian's, the evasive answers, the way she always seemed to hold something back. But now he had a clue, a weak point, and he was determined to go all the way. "I don't know anything. Is that what you have to tell me?" He paused, his face closer to hers, his eyes hard. "With every vague answer, I'm only more convinced that you're lying." The doctor, seeing what he had caused, excused himself and mumbled an apology to walk away. But Cassian remained there, feeling her heart racing, panic taking over. She knew she had no easy way out, but she wasn't ready to reveal the truth. There were things Edmund wouldn't understand, that perhaps he could never forgive. Each of his questions was like a needle poking an old wound, and the control she always tried to maintain was slipping through her fingers. "Edmund, for God's sake, trust me. There's nothing you need to know. Please believe me," she said, her voice faltering, almost pleading. But her plea only reinforced Edmund's determination. He was tired of the half-truths, the omissions, the lies that seemed to accompany Cassian like a shadow. Determined to get answers, he firmly gripped her arm as if he wanted to force the truth out of her if necessary. "Enough lies, Cassian. I'm tired of this trust me story," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to tell me what you're hiding, and you're going to tell me now. Who is this dead son he was talking about?" he asked without hesitation. Cassian tried to break free, but his look, full of resentment and distrust, seemed to penetrate her soul, revealing what she was trying to hide. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and, upon opening them, saw that she had no escape. Edmund stared fixedly at Cassian, each second of her silence increasing his anger and frustration. The evasive answer she insisted on giving only fueled the feeling that she was hiding something important, something he was determined to unravel. He had already waited too many years to face those buried secrets. In the face of her refusal to speak, he felt an outburst of anger that he could not control. Her look was one of fear, but also of resistance, as if she would rather endure anything than confess what she was hiding. "You're coming with me, Cassian. Now," he said coldly, leaving no room for discussion. "But be discreet. Don't scare my guests." She hesitated, trying to process what he would do, but his expression was relentless. He grabbed her by the arm and led her down the hall, ignoring the slight resistance she was still trying to offer. The guests, focused on the party, didn't notice the tense moment between mother and son. Edmund took her to a discreet door, away from the party's movement, and led her to the attic, a rarely used, quiet and isolated place. Cassian followed him, feeling the panic growing with every step. She knew that look. It was the same look she had when she took out her frustrations and anger on him as a child. When they reached the attic, he pushed her inside, and the heavy, dusty air of the environment only increased the claustrophobic feeling that was invading her. She took a step back, her heart racing, her breathing ragged. "Edmund, please. What are you doing? This is not how we're going to resolve things," she said, her voice trembling, feeling his strength holding the door open in a way that made her fear the worst. But Edmund was beyond any appeal or argument. Her silence about the dead son, her look that seemed to contain more than she admitted, all of that enraged him. He wanted her to experience the feeling of being in the dark, locked up and powerless, just as he had felt so many times as a child. Without any compassion in his gaze, he took a step back and closed the attic door, locking her outside. "What are you going to tell me, Mother? That you don't like being locked in the dark? That it seems scary? Like it's hard to breathe, isn't it?" "Your heart raced, I think. If you don't want to tell me the truth, then you'll stay here, Cassian, as punishment. After all, isn't that how we teach a lesson? You'll stay here until you have the courage to speak," he said coldly, the words laden with an unwavering resentment. On the other side of the door, Cassian took a step back, trying to absorb what had just happened. She approached the door, frantically banging her hands, desperation replacing any trace of dignity. The memory of what she had done to Edmund in his childhood was now an almost unbearable weight. She knew what it meant to be locked up, isolated as he had been so many times because of her. "Edmund, please get me out of here. This won't help us. Please don't leave me here." She pounded on the door, her voice broken by fear and guilt. He listened from outside, but remained impassive, his face as cold as stone. Each of her pleas seemed only to reinforce his decision, as if he was finally obtaining the justice he had so desired. It was his turn to see his mother vulnerable, alone and desperate. His turn to control the situation she had always controlled. "I'll leave you alone until you realize you can no longer hide anything from me, Cassian." "That's the price for years of lies," he murmured, as if reaffirming his decision to himself. Inside, Cassian's despair only grew. The dark and stuffy environment made her feel like she was struggling to breathe, while the weight of loneliness and silence closed in around her. She began to cry, feeling a physical pain that seemed to come from the weight of her choices and regrets. The feeling of weakness and fragility took hold of her, and her legs began to tremble. Each pounding on the door was an attempt to free herself not only from the attic, but from everything she had kept bottled up for so long. "Please, please, Edmund, don't do this to me. I can't take it anymore," she whispered, sliding to the floor, her voice almost inaudible amid the sobs. The darkness seemed to intensify her anguish, and the stale air left her drained of strength. Memories of the past, of times when she had been merciless to Edmund, now surfaced with crushing force. She felt her body giving way, her mind losing control, and the guilt of all those years collapsing upon her with a suffocating intensity. "This is what I deserve. I can't escape what I've done," she thought, her breathing becoming increasingly difficult, the weight of regret becoming almost physical. As she slid across the floor, Cassian hugged her knees, her fragile body trembling. Cassian felt panic growing like an uncontrollable wave within her. The darkness of the attic pressed in on her, and the silence made her lose her sense of time. Each passing second increased her sensation of suffocation and dragged her deeper into her memories, which now surfaced as inevitable torments. Sitting on the cold and dusty floor, tears flowed freely down her face as she relived every mistake, every cruel choice that had led her to this point. Guilt took hold of her like a physical presence, tightening her chest and making it difficult to breathe. "Edmund, please, don't do this to me. I can't take it anymore. I regret it," she whispered almost incoherently, her sobs cutting off her words. The walls of the attic seemed to close in around her, growing tighter and darker. Cassian tried to remember her son's face when he was little, how he looked at her seeking love only to find coldness. Now it was she who looked at the door, seeking an exit, a compassion she might never find. She pounded on the door, first with force and then with weakness as her strength abandoned her. The feeling that she deserved to be there began to invade her thoughts, a mixture of self-punishment and regret that consumed her. "I deserve this. I deserve it," she murmured between sobs, her hands clenching into fists as her own voice echoed through the empty space. Sometime later, silence took over the house. The party was over. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from outside. Cassian raised her head, hope mixed with fear. The door opened slowly, revealing the figure of Edmund, who looked at her with a coldness that now seemed even sharper, while she was so vulnerable. He remained still at the entrance, arms crossed, observing her from above without a trace of empathy or tenderness. Cassian tried to get up, but her legs faltered, and she leaned against the wall with a pleading look. "Edmund, please forgive me. I know I was wrong, I know I have no excuse, but don't leave me here, I can't stand it. I have a way to explain. My son, I have to tell you the truth. Please listen to me," she begged, her voice broken and choked with tears. But he merely observed her as if faced with something unimportant, something he could easily ignore or discard. With each word she spoke, he maintained an impassive expression, as if her suffering were merely a worthless detail. Cassian realized that he was judging her, that her pain caused him no compassion, but only a cold and bitter satisfaction. In desperation, she began to beat herself in the face, trying to express the pain she felt, the guilt that consumed her, and the desire to erase everything. "I need to explain, even if you don't understand. Anything is better than this hatred you feel for me. It's better than this emptiness. I can't take it anymore." She screamed, her voice broken by sobs, the words coming out like a plea for redemption. He continued to watch her, his expression unshakable without a trace of pity. Seeing Cassian in that state did not bring him the satisfaction he had imagined, but it also did not move him. For him, that collapse was a sight that only reaffirmed his decision not to give in. Finally, after a long silence, he took a deep breath, as if he were bored with the scene, and crossed his arms. "Enough, Cassian. This doesn't change anything," he said in a chilling tone that made her shudder. "You can humiliate yourself as much as you want, but the past can't be erased with tears." Cassian looked at him, her eyes still wet as if he were her last hope for redemption. His words fell like stones, crushing any hope she might have nurtured that he would forgive her. She was in tatters, with her mind and body shattered, but even so she could not abandon the hope that he would one day understand her. "Please, Edmund, just listen to me. Let me explain. I would do anything to change what I did. But give me a chance to speak," she begged, her voice almost a whisper. He gave a slight smile, but it was not one of compassion. It was the smile of someone who knew he had control of the situation, someone who could finally decide the fate of the one who had imprisoned him for years. For him, that was a small victory, but the satisfaction was cold and empty, as if he had already surpassed any expectation of seeing his mother in an emotional collapse. "Get up, Cassian," he said through clenched teeth, his voice laden with contempt. "Let's go for a walk." He watched her get up, her body still trembling and her expression marked by despair. Cassian wiped away the tears with the backs of her hands, trying to compose herself, but the pain remained visible in her eyes. She followed him in silence, unable to understand what he intended, but knowing that somehow he was leading her to a new judgment. Cassian followed Edmund to the car, her steps stumbling, as if the weight of each memory prevented her from walking firmly. The silence between them was almost unbearable, and the sound of her shoes dragging on the floor echoed through the empty garage. She looked at his back, his posture rigid and determined, and with each step she took she felt the despair growing in her chest. She had no idea what he intended, but the coldness on Edmund's face was a harbinger of something she deeply feared. He opened the passenger door, indicating for her to get in. Cassian hesitated for a moment, her trembling hand resting on the car window. She wanted to ask, beg, plead for a little compassion, but the words did not come out, swallowed by the tension and exhaustion. With an almost inaudible sigh, she got into the car, her fingers clutched in her lap, as if that could give her some control over the situation. Edmund drove along the dark road, remaining silent while Cassian in the passenger seat trembled, still in shock from the collapse she had just had. The car advanced farther and farther from the city, and the dense forest around swallowed the light from the headlights. Cassian, still trying to understand what was happening, looked at Edmund in despair, but he kept his face impassive, his eyes fixed on the road. She realized that there was no compassion or hesitation in his demeanor. The son seemed completely consumed by resentment and coldness. "Edmund, where are we going? Please, Ekai. Take me home," she murmured, her voice still trembling and weak, her pleading eyes toward his face. Edmund did not respond. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter, his fingers white with tension, as he continued driving toward the forest. Cassian began to feel an intense chill within her, a certainty that something very wrong was about to happen. Every second of silence between them increased her anguish. Fear took hold of her chest, and she shrank into the seat, feeling smaller and smaller, more and more fragile in the face of her son's hardness. Finally, Edmund stopped the car at an isolated point on the road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked any trace of light. The storm that had been threatening for hours finally began, and the rain was pouring down, forming puddles on the muddy road. Edmund got out of the car without looking at her, and Cassian, hesitant, got out too, confused and frightened. He looked at her with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction, as if that were the outcome he had planned for a long time. "You wanted answers, didn't you? You wanted forgiveness. You wanted redemption." "Well, Cassian," he said, his voice loud and cutting, muffled only by the sound of the rain, "I won't take care of you anymore. Stay here to die, just like you made me die inside all those years." Cassian looked at him in disbelief, her face pale and her lips trembling, not knowing whether it was the cold or the fear that dominated her. The cruelty in his words was a blow that left her breathless, and she tried to approach him, to beg him not to do that, but Edmund took a step back, raising his hand to prevent any approach. "Edmund, no! Don't leave me here. Please don't do this to me," she begged, her voice failing as tears mixed with the rain on her face. But he just looked at her with disdain, his eyes relentless, as if every word of hers was just another reason to walk away. He got into the car and, without saying anything else, started the engine. Cassian ran towards the vehicle, her hands outstretched, banging on the window, but he didn't look back. He stepped on the accelerator and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone under the rain that fell like a sentence. Cassian stood for a few seconds, unable to process what had just happened. The cold rain was soaking her, and the icy wind was cutting her skin, but the worst was the overwhelming loneliness that dominated her. She looked around, but there was nothing, no one who could hear her. The thunders echoed through the forest, and the tall trees seemed like threatening shadows surrounding her on all sides. "He left me. He really left me here," she whispered, almost unbelieving, as the tears continued to flow. She began to walk along the muddy road, disoriented, her feet sinking into the mud, her clothes heavy and cold clinging to her body. The incessant rain made it difficult for her to see, and every step seemed like a gigantic effort. Her lips began to turn purple, and the cold penetrated her bones, making it impossible to stop shivering. Her legs grew weak, and every movement was painful, as if her body itself was giving up. Maybe I deserve all this," she thought, trying to find a reason to keep going. The darkness of the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and Cassian began to lose her way, the cold and despair clouding her mind. The rain was falling harder and harder, and she could barely see her own path. The muddy puddles covered the ground, and in a moment of weakness, she stumbled, falling to her knees, her hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. Her breathing became gasping, and sobs took over her body. "Edmund, please, forgive me. I did what I could," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, as if she were speaking into the void. Cassian's strength was abandoning her, and she dragged herself through the mud, her fingers clawing at the earth as the cold paralyzed her. She felt the dampness entering her skin, deeper and deeper, as hope faded away. The rain seemed to intensify, and the sound of the wind cut through the night like a distant lament. Finally exhausted, she gave in to the weight of her body and fell sideways into a puddle, the mud covering part of her face, the relentless cold. The last thing she saw was a point of light approaching, the headlights of a car cutting through the darkness of the night. She felt a glimmer of hope, but her eyes were heavy and her vision was starting to blur. The sound of hurried footsteps approached, and a distant voice called out to her, but she could no longer distinguish words. Only the cold remained, as her consciousness slowly faded away. An elderly man, Walter, a resident of the region, was passing by and was shocked to see the old lady lying on the ground. He approached with quick steps, his eyes wide as he saw Cassian's state, semi-conscious and without the strength to ask for help. Ma'am, hold on," he said, his voice trembling with concern. "You'll be safe soon, you just need to hold on a little longer," he murmured as he covered her with his coat, noticing how pale her face was and how her lips were purple. With great care, Walter lifted her and took her to his house, where he laid her on the couch and quickly rummaged through Cassian's pockets, looking for a contact number. He found a contact called Edmund and tried to call several times, but each call was rejected. Walter, incredulous, hung up the phone with a sigh of sadness and just called the emergency number and waited for the ambulance to arrive, his expression anxious as he held Cassian's hand. "Ma'am, please, hold on. The doctors will be here soon," he repeated, watching her breathing grow weaker. The ambulance finally arrived, and the paramedics quickly put Cassian on the stretcher, trying to warm her up while observing the signs of severe hypothermia. During the journey to the hospital, they tried to stabilize her temperature, but the cold had already penetrated deep into her organs, and her life hung by a thread. Upon arriving at the hospital, Cassian was taken directly to the emergency room, where the medical team began an intense battle to keep her alive. The first days were of uncertainty. Cassian was unconscious, and her body resisted treatments. The cold had caused damage already caused by her frail health, and doctors feared that her organs would begin to fail. Despite efforts to warm her up and stabilize her vital signs, the prognosis was grim. Each hour that passed, Cassian's resistance seemed to diminish, and many believed she would not survive the first night. "We need to do everything possible to keep this lady stable," said one of the doctors, his expression laden with fatigue. "But we cannot guarantee that she will resist. Her chances are unlikely." However, against all expectations, Cassian survived. Slowly, her body began to respond to the care, and although she was still weak, she opened her eyes days later, with a vacant and distant expression. She perceived the environment around her, the white walls and the constant sound of machines, but her mind was elsewhere, returning to the moments before Edmund abandoned her in the forest. The pain of abandonment was stronger than any physical wound, and she felt a sharp emptiness in her chest. In an attempt to cling to something that would keep her alive, Cassian began writing letters to Edmund daily. In her mind, he was still her son, and she believed that somehow her words could reach his heart. Every day she wrote little notes, as if she were rebuilding a bond, even if he never read them. "Son, today it was sunny. I remembered you playing in the garden, running on the lawn," she wrote in one of the first letters, her hand trembling, each letter a struggle. These letters became her daily refuge. It was a routine that gave her purpose and helped alleviate the loneliness of that cold hospital room. "Son, I learned to crochet. I thought of making you a blanket," she wrote in another, the words revealing an affection she had never been able to show before. Each note was an attempt at reconciliation, a way to say everything she had never said before. "Son, I dreamed of you as a little boy. I miss seeing your face," said one of the most emotional letters, where Cassian recalled the time when Edmund was just an innocent child before all the pain and resentment. Her hope, however, was frustrated every time she saw the letters returned, the envelopes still sealed. Edmund refused to read them, and each time the letters came back to her, the pain intensified. The rejection was like a silent blade, cutting through every hope she nurtured. Still, she continued to write, as if the mere act of putting her words on paper could ease her pain, but the weight of rejection was slowly draining her strength. "He will never answer, but I need to keep trying. I can't stop now," she whispered to herself, keeping her determination. For weeks, Cassian dedicated herself to this routine, keeping each letter in a box by her hospital bed. The doctors and nurses saw the weariness taking over her, but no one knew exactly what was going through her mind. Despite all the care, her health was increasingly debilitated, and the signs of deterioration became more visible every day. The sadness and emotional exhaustion were taking a heavy toll, and the doctors were beginning to lose hope that she could fully recover. As the weeks passed, Cassian felt her strength ebbing away, as if the weight of abandonment was slowly draining what little was left of her. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, once full of a fragile hope, now had a dull glow. Every day she felt weaker, and her body no longer responded as it once had. The doctors realized the situation was becoming critical and discussed among themselves the need to call a relative. "She won't last much longer," said the doctor in charge with a grave look at his colleagues. "We need someone who can be here. Maybe it's the last chance for her to say goodbye," the doctor said. The nurses decided to try to contact Edmund again, even though he had ignored their calls before. Edmund was in the middle of an important meeting, surrounded by executives and advisors who eagerly awaited his decision on a merger that could revolutionize the company. His posture was firm and his expression cold, as always. He was known for maintaining absolute control, no matter what was at stake. The conference room was immersed in a respectful silence, and all eyes were turned toward him, awaiting his final opinion. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated silently next to his hand. Normally, he would ignore a call at that moment, but something made him look at the screen. Seeing that the number was unknown, he hesitated, but decided to answer quickly, moving away from the watchful eyes surrounding him. "Mr. Edmund, this is Central Hospital," said a firm, professional voice on the other end of the line. "Your mother is in. Well, she seems about to depart this world. She asked us to inform you that she wishes to see you, as she needs to tell you something important before she leaves. Something related to the medical records of your childhood." Edmund was silent for a moment, the information hitting him unexpectedly. He had always believed that Cassian's estrangement was definitive, that she would never seek any sincere contact again. Now the mention of medical records of your childhood sounded strange and deeply disturbing. He took a deep breath, showing nothing to his team, who continued to await his decision in the meeting. "Medical records, about my childhood?" His voice came out with a tone of surprise that he tried to hide, but the discomfort overwhelmed him. "Yes, sir," the voice on the other end of the line continued. "She insisted it was something essential for you to know before it's too late," the voice said. Edmund ended the call, his face hardened as he processed the information. He had always believed he knew the full story, that the resentment and memories of his childhood were the only legacies Cassian had left. But there was something in those words, medical records of childhood, that seemed to break through the barriers of his resistance. The team looked at him expectantly, but he raised a hand, indicating that he could not continue at that moment. "I need to resolve something urgent," he said, his voice firm and leaving no room for questions. As he headed to the hospital, an avalanche of thoughts assailed him. He recalled the distant and cold figure of Cassian in his childhood, the times when he felt that she was not just a severe mother, but almost an enemy, someone who always seemed to want to punish him for reasons he never understood. Now the possibility arose that there was something more, something he had never imagined. Edmund entered the hospital room, observing his mother lying in bed, frail, and supported only by tubes and machines. She looked so small, so different from the authoritarian figure that dominated his childhood memories. Cassian, upon seeing him, tried to get up, but her weakness was evident. With trembling hands, she held an old folder worn by time, as if it were the last link to a secret she had kept her entire life. "Son," Cassian began, her voice failing with the emotion and frailty that gripped her. "I asked the nurses to go to my house to get this folder. I need you to understand, Edmund, please, before it's too late." Edmund looked at her with distrust, but did not look away. His expression was impassive, still marked by the hurt of years of rejection and suffering. Cassian, breathing with difficulty, opened the folder and pulled out a series of yellowed documents. She held them like someone holding an immense but unavoidable weight. "When you were born," Cassian whispered, almost in a lament, "the doctors told me you wouldn't survive. Your heart had a rare condition, a malformation. They said you wouldn't live past 10 years old. A single shock, a strong emotion, and you could die," she began, making Edmund feel a wave of shock. Her words fell on him like a storm, but he remained silent, processing what he was hearing. Cassian turned the first page of the report, where the diagnosis that seemed like a sentence was clearly read: congenital heart malformation. Next to it, there was a stamp and a doctor's signature, dated decades ago. "I spent years in despair, Edmund, trying to understand how to protect you, but then they told me about an experimental treatment. Only it was too dangerous. Hundreds of children died trying. Most parents didn't even consider it and let their children pass away, but I knew it was your only chance. our only chance. But for the treatment to work, they said you needed to have an extraordinary emotional resistance. Absolute control over your emotions. They needed to be sure that your heart could withstand every moment. They made it clear that if you didn't have the emotional resistance for the treatment, you would die within 24 hours after the treatment, but that you would die if you didn't do it. She looked at him, trying to read something in his expression, but Edmund remained rigid, cold. He continued to flip through the pages, seeing childhood photos there. Himself small, connected to machines in the hospital, next to other children who, he now knew, did not survive the treatment. Those faded memories resurfaced, and each of them brought a feeling of discomfort and uncertainty. That's why I did what I did, Edmund," Cassian continued, tears streaming down her face. "Every tear of yours, every humiliation, every moment when I seemed cruel, it was all to build that resistance, to prepare your heart. I forced you to endure things no child should endure. But it was either that or losing you. I became the monster you needed to survive. The doctors said this was your only chance. I was desperate, my son, desperate. I was so afraid of losing you, so afraid of not having you with me anymore." Edmund felt the weight of those words and looked at her with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You tortured me, made me hate you, locked me in the dark, all because you thought it would make me stronger. I was just a child, Mother." Cassian nodded, her eyes closed with the pain of a mother who never wished to hurt her own son, but who found herself with no choice. She raised another page from the folder and showed a report with details of each event, each episode of pain that Edmund faced. Each of these moments was meticulously planned. "I noted your heartbeats, your reactions. I needed to measure the intensity. Any mistake, if it was too strong, could have been fatal, and if it was too weak, it would have been for nothing." She pointed to a passage where the doctor stated, "Patient demonstrates remarkable capacity for emotional control at this age, surprising progress." Edmund clenched his fists, feeling crushed by the revelation. He remembered the dark room, the nights when he calmed himself by counting breaths, seeking a place of peace amidst the abandonment he felt. At that moment, for him, it had been pure cruelty. Now she claimed it was training. "The dark room," he muttered, not looking at her, still processing the memory. "You told me it was punishment, but you were just training my breathing?" he asked, disbelieving, and Cassian nodded, her face marked by pain and regret. "Yes. I drank to endure what I had to put you through. Every scream you heard, every cruel word, they were rehearsed. I measured every detail through a watch I gave you as a gift. It measured your heartbeats. I knew that if it was too weak, it wouldn't prepare you, but if it was too strong, it could kill you, but I didn't want to lose you, even if you hated me afterwards. The world needed to have you, to see the incredible boy you were." She then revealed the diary, an old worn notebook with meticulous notes. Each page detailed Edmund's heartbeats, emotional reactions, the exact words she should use to provoke a controlled response. "This is the diary, Edmund. Every word I said to you was here. It was part of the process. I became a monster so that you could survive. Hating me was what kept your heart strong." Edmund flipped through the diary, seeing the coldness of the numbers and observations, and something inside him began to break. Everything he had known about his childhood seemed to crumble under the weight of that revelation. He remembered the countless hospital visits, the forced goodbyes, and the returns laden with resentment, the bitter taste of burnt cake, the rhythm of breathing on dark nights. Everything now took on a meaning he had never imagined. With a trembling voice, Cassian continued, "When you turned 10, the doctor said your heart had transformed, something he had never seen. He said it was a miracle, but it wasn't a miracle, Edmund. It was you. You, strong, resilient. You endured because I forced you to be stronger than any child should be. I know they weren't the best methods, but it was my only chance of not losing you forever, my son. A world without a son for a mother is a world without color. I couldn't imagine enduring that pain, so I did everything so that I wouldn't have to live through that, even if you would never love me again." Cassian's tears now flowed freely. "I spent every night praying that one day you would understand, that someday, if you survived, you would know that all my love was in every one of my actions, that one day you would allow me to explain. but I know I made myself a monster to you, and I accept that. I chose to be the villain in your story so that you would have a story to tell." Edmund watched each page, touched each photograph, but found no words. The weight of what he had discovered was overwhelming. He placed his hand on his own chest, feeling the heart that, according to her, beat thanks to every moment of suffering. A whirlwind of emotions invaded his mind, and he wondered how he would ever be able to forgive her, or if he should. Cassian, sensing that her son was about to drift away again, reached out to him. "Son, even if you continue to hate me, even if you never forgive me, know that every moment I hurt you, every tear you shed, was so that your heart would keep beating, so that you would survive this life. I did it all out of love, Anna, a love you may never understand. But know that, even being this monster in your eyes, I always loved you." Edmund stared at his mother's aged face, the marks of suffering visible, her eyes full of remorse and hope. Hating her now seemed as natural as loving her, and he was caught between the two feelings. Edmund felt his mother's words hit his heart with the force of a devastating revelation. He was still holding the diary and papers that proved Cassian's silent sacrifice, and the truth she had told him seemed to absorb every shred of resentment he had ever harbored. The years of pain and bitterness turned into an unbearable weight of regret. Cassian's expression was one of tenderness and guilt, her eyes shining with a love that he, finally, began to understand. Unable to contain himself any longer, Edmund let the papers fall beside the bed, and with a sob he never imagined would come out of his throat, he knelt beside his mother. Tears rolled freely down his face, and his breathing was broken, almost desperate. "Mom, if I had known, if I had found out sooner." He held her hand tightly, his eyes red from crying, his body shaken by sobs. "Please forgive me. All the hatred I harbored, every time I pushed you away. For abandoning you, I never understood. I never knew that everything you did was out of love, to save me." Cassian looked at him, the weakness in her face softened by a tender smile. She raised her hand with difficulty, running her fingers across his face, as if she wanted to wipe away the tears he shed. Her voice was a whisper, but every word carried the strength of a lifetime of suffering and hope. "My son, you never owed me anything. Never." Her words were calm, like a final confession. "My only wish was always for you to live. Live strong, even if you hated me, even if I was never forgiven. I did it out of love for you. I always loved you, Edmund, from the very first second until my last." Edmund lowered his head, the weight of everything he had harbored in his chest unraveling in a stream of bitter regret. He leaned further, pressing his forehead against her hand as tears continued to wet his eyes. Every childhood moment, every lonely birthday, every night in the dark now seemed an unbearable burden, and he desperately wanted to undo it all. The words came out broken, laden with a pain he didn't know how to bear. "Forgive me. Forgive me, Mom. I was blind. I was cruel. I thought you were my enemy and you were saving me." He looked at her, his face full of despair. "If I had known, if I had understood sooner, I would never have left you alone. Never." Cassian looked at him, her expression serene, but a glimmer of happiness filled her eyes. With an effort, she squeezed his hand and murmured, "Now you know, Edmund, and that's more than I could have ever dreamed." She took a deep breath, the words coming out with effort. "I love you. I've always loved you. Since the very first day, my son." But as she spoke, a visible weakness took hold of her body, and her face began to lose color. Edmund watched her with growing despair, seeing the light in her eyes starting to fade. He felt panic take over and gripped her hand tighter, as if that could keep her there, as if his belated love could make up for all the years of distance. "Mother, no, please don't leave me now. You can't leave now. I still need you." He felt his voice falter, the words coming out as a desperate plea. "I love you, Mom. Can you hear me? I love you." But before she could respond, Cassian's body began to tremble slightly. Her eyes closing and a silent collapse overtook her. Edmund leaned over her, his heart racing, despair growing as he called out to her, holding her in his arms. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room quickly, and two of them held him by the shoulders, trying to pull him away. "Please, sir, we need you to step out. one of them said urgently, as Edmund struggled to stay by his mother's side, his eyes desperate, his hands trying to hold on to any part of her. "No, she can't leave me. I just understood. I just forgave her," he shouted, the pain in his voice almost unbearable. "Please, Mom, listen to me. Gus, don't go now. I need you." The doctors pulled him away, closing the door as they prepared to intervene, and Edmund stood outside, his face buried in his hands, his body trembling with despair. He felt the crushing emptiness take over as her last words echoed in his mind, bringing him the realization of all they had lost, of every moment he had wasted in resentment. "I love you, Mom," he whispered into the void, tears streaming uncontrollably. Forgive me for not seeing sooner." Edmund watched from the door as the doctors focused on Cassian, the urgency in their movements underscoring the gravity of the moment. With each passing second, he felt the despair rising like an uncontrollable wave within him. His hands were shaking, and his heart seemed to beat faster and faster as he saw Cassian's frail body under the cold white hospital lights, surrounded by tubes and wires, motionless, inert. The monitor displaying Cassian's heartbeat emitted a continuous sound, beeping on a single note, the terrifying sound that confirmed her heart had stopped. "Mom, no, please, no," he murmured, his face already wet with tears as he watched the doctors urgently try to resuscitate her. Edmund felt his legs grow weak, and without hesitation he rushed into the room, ignoring the surprised looks of the doctors, and knelt beside the bed. With his eyes closed and head bowed, he began to pray, something he hadn't done since childhood, grasping at a last hope. "Please, God, please give me back my mother. I wasted so much time. I rejected her, but now I understand. I just wanted a chance to love her as she deserves," he whispered, his lips trembling. "Give me one more chance and I'll do everything differently. I promise, please, let her live." He prayed with the faith of his heart. Edmund's tears continued to flow, and he clasped his hands together in prayer, sobs punctuating his words as he surrendered to a desperate plea. The memories of every moment he had wasted became an unbearable weight. He longed with all his being to undo the grievances, erase the years of resentment and hatred. "Mom, you can't leave me now." "Not now," he murmured, lifting his face to see her expression, which remained unchanged, empty. Suddenly, one of the doctors picked up the defibrillator, placing it on Cassian's chest as everyone present held their breath. Edmund, kneeling, watched every movement, a deep anguish taking hold of him. The seconds seemed endless until the monitor emitted a faint sound, indicating her heart had started beating again. Edmund let out a choked sigh, hope filling him as he watched his mother start to respond. "She's back. God, thank you. I won't waste this chance. I'll be the best son, the son she deserves. I'll take care of her with all the affection. We'll finally have our chance," he murmured, the relief bringing warmer tears to his eyes, but this time of gratitude. The doctors continued monitoring Cassian, and after long minutes she slowly opened her eyes. The sight of Edmund was the first thing she saw, and a slight smile formed on her lips as she saw him there, by her side. Edmund moved closer, holding her hand with a tenderness he had never shown before, his eyes still moist. "You came back, Mom. I thought it was too late." His voice was low, laden with emotion. "Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for not giving up on me." Cassian squeezed his hand with what little strength she had, and a visible peace reflected on her face. "My son, I've always been with you. I love you. From the very first day, always," she whispered, her voice weak but full of tenderness. Throughout the following weeks, Cassian gradually recovered. Each visit from Edmund was marked by loving words and gestures of love, a transformation she embraced with all her heart. He dedicated himself to helping her recover, participating in physiotherapy sessions and assisting her in walking, his constant support, a warm and peaceful presence by her side. The conversations between the two, once filled with resentment, now became moments of connection and love, as if every word healed old wounds. "Son, every day you are here is a gift to me," she would say, tenderly holding his hand. "My heart always knew you were strong. I love you for everything, and for everything we will still become." Edmund moved, would kiss her hands with gratitude. "Mother, all I want now is to give you the peaceful life you deserve. Forgive me for everything I put you through. I was a fool, I didn't understand. But I promise you will have the son who will take care of you and do everything to ensure you receive all the love we should have had from the beginning." When Cassian was discharged, Edmund insisted on taking her back to his own home again. Upon arriving, they were warmly welcomed by Agatha, Edmund's wife, who opened her arms and gave Cassian a welcoming, affectionate embrace. From that day on, Cassian came to live with them, fully integrated into family life in a loving way. She finally experienced the affection and acceptance she had always desired but had, for so many years, thought impossible. Gradually, Cassian's presence brought a new spirit to the house. Agatha and Edmund cared for her with complete dedication, and Cassian, in turn, reciprocated with a happiness that radiated through the house's corridors, strengthening family bonds. She shared stories from Edmund's childhood, moments he had forgotten, before the moments he remembered, moments before his mother had begun to take such a drastic decision to save him, and each memory was now a source of laughter and reconciliation. "Mother, why did you never tell me I loved climbing the garden trees?" Edmund asked one day, laughing at the stories she told Agatha. Cassian, with a smile on her lips, replied, "Because you were always an adventurer, my son. And I always knew you had a brave heart, even in the moments when you didn't realize it." Months later, Edmund and Agatha's home was a place full of life and peace, a completely different scene from the tense environment it had once been. Time had transformed every corner of that residence into a space where joy, affection, and reconciliation occupied all places. Cassian, now recovered, integrated seamlessly into the family's routine, with a naturalness that left Edmund increasingly grateful. He watched his mother, now with a renewed sparkle in her eyes, moving through the house as if she had never left it. Her presence was a constant reminder of all they had overcome. Cassian spent much of her mornings on the porch, where she liked to sit and observe the garden that Edmund and Agatha had cultivated. The exuberant nature surrounding them was a living metaphor for the new cycle they were experiencing. She often invited Agatha to join her for a cup of tea, and together they shared stories and laughter, as if they were long-time friends. Gradually, Edmund allowed himself to feel and express the love he had once repressed. He not only accepted his mother into his life, but valued her, cared for her, and made her an essential part of his new family, redeeming himself for his mistakes. One day, while tidying up the living room, Agatha found the box with the letters, and upon reading one of them realized how much Cassian had loved and cared for Edmund, even from a distance. On impulse, she took the box to Edmund, who fell silent upon receiving those papers so charged with emotion. He spent hours reading each letter, absorbing the depth of his mother's feelings, which even in moments of greatest distance had never stopped loving and protecting her son. That night, Edmund approached Cassian and with teary eyes hugged her tightly. "Mother, you gave me much more than I could ever comprehend," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I wish you knew how grateful I am, for everything. How much I regret. How much I love you." Cassian returned the embrace with the same affection, saying nothing, for she knew that words in that moment would not be enough. She felt she was finally complete, that all the years of sacrifice and silence now found an unexpected peace. Family life became established, and over the months Cassian became an indispensable presence in Edmund and Agatha's lives. She helped organize the house, taught Agatha old family recipes, and accompanied her son in leisure moments. On weekends, they often went out together for walks in the countryside or lunches in peaceful places where they would converse for hours. Edmund, in turn, became more open and light-hearted. He felt that, alongside Cassian and Agatha, he had rediscovered parts of himself that had been dormant for so long. Smiles came more easily, and he perceived happiness in every detail of family life. It was as if time had finally brought the redemption and joy he had never believed he deserved. On a special afternoon, as they were all gathered in the living room, Edmund raised his voice, breaking the silence with a phrase that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Mother, Agatha, you are my family, and I would do anything to ensure that this home we have built never falls apart." He smiled with a sincerity that deeply touched everyone there. Cassian, with shining eyes, answered with a smile full of love. So that's it, my son. True strength lies not in our mistakes, but in the love we find along the way. And today, with you by my side, I know every moment was worth it, for we are finally together. The family continued to share their days, savoring the simplicity of each moment, knowing that every smile, every loving gesture was the result of a resilient love that had overcome the greatest trials. Cassian, alongside Edmund and Agatha, found in everyday life the true meaning of home, something he had long desired but only now discovered was possible. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.